In recent months, the world came surprisingly close to a serious geopolitical crisis over Greenland. What started as an aggressive U.S. pressure campaign quickly backfired, uniting European leaders and shaking the foundations of NATO itself. According to detailed geopolitical analysis, this episode didn't just fail. It weakened American influence and gave strategic advantages to rivals like Russia and China. Today, we're going to break down what really happened based on verified sources and serious research.
Welcome to The Explainer. You know, what started out as a really bizarre headline, the U.S. wanting to buy Greenland, spiraled into something much, much bigger. Today, we're going to break down how that strange gambit nearly shattered the entire Western alliance.
And you know, that wasn't coming from some rival country. That was from Washington's closest friends. It all kicked off with this unprecedented pressure campaign from the United States, aimed right at Denmark over Greenland. And for a lot of allies, that just crossed a very, very dangerous line. But then, just as things were reaching a boiling point, it was over. Just like that. The White House slammed on the brakes, announced this so-called agreement that really didn't change much, and called off the threatened tariffs. And it left everybody with one huge question. Well, the answer to that pulls back the curtain on just how fragile the world order really is, and how this one single event pushed the whole transatlantic alliance right to the edge of a cliff. So let's unravel what was really going on here. Okay, so the first piece of the puzzle is Europe's reaction. And honestly, it was something we rarely see. They were firm, they were strategic, and for once they were all on the same page. A truly solid front. And I mean, this pushback was coming from everywhere. You had Poland's prime minister at the time, Donald Tusk, representing one of America's staunchest allies, calling for a tougher response. You had Italy's Giorgia Meloni calling it a very clear mistake. From east to west, the message was unmistakable. This is a step too far. But here's the thing. Europe didn't just complain. They played it smart. They brought out the stick, making it crystal clear that any tariffs from the U.S. would trigger a wave of counter-tariffs, risking a nasty trade war. But at the same time, they offered a carrot, giving Washington a political win by dropping this controversial digital tax they've been fighting over. It was a textbook move, really. You show your teeth, but you also give your opponent a way to back down without losing face. But look, this was about so much more than tariffs. The real reason Washington backed down is because its advisors finally realized this whole gambit was about to knock over 3 catastrophic dominoes, and each one was worse than the last. The first domino? The economy. The economic relationship between the U.S. and Europe isn't just important, it's literally the foundation of the entire global financial system. First, just think about trade. We're talking about a 1.6 times trillion euro highway of goods and services flowing across the Atlantic every single year. A full-blown trade war would have slammed the brakes on a huge chunk of that, killing jobs and growth on both sides. But you know, trade is one thing. The really terrifying risk was investment. Investors in the EU hold an estimated $10 trillion in U.S. assets. Now imagine a political crisis shatters their confidence. If they start dumping those assets, you could see a stock market crash and a dollar crisis in the blink of an eye. And this is where Europe holds a massive trump card. They control 40% of all foreign-held U.S. government debt. If they even hinted at selling those bonds, American borrowing costs would skyrocket. That's how a trade dispute turns into a national debt crisis overnight. Okay, so that's the economy. The second domino was even scarier. The potential collapse of NATO, probably the most successful military alliance in all of history. You know, we mostly think of NATO as a shield pointed at Russia, but it's always had this other hidden job. It's been a kind of geopolitical straitjacket that keeps the peace inside Europe. It's the reason old rivalries, like between Greece and Turkey or Hungary and Romania, haven't boiled over into war. And right here is the paradox that threatened to blow the whole thing up. The entire alliance is built on this secret principle. You do not threaten another member's territory, period. But the Greenland Gambit was exactly that, the most powerful member of NATO using threats to try and take land from another member. It just fundamentally violated the trust that the whole alliance is built on. So if the first 2 dominoes weren't terrifying enough for you, the third and final one was the very real risk of a new, uncontrolled nuclear arms race. The logic here is chillingly simple. For 70 years, countries like Poland, Sweden, even Canada,
have been able to rely on the U.S. nuclear umbrella to keep them safe. But if that alliance suddenly looks worthless, what's their plan B? Well, for the first time in decades, leaders in all those countries started asking that question out loud, publicly talking about needing their own nuclear weapons. And look, this whole internal meltdown of the West wasn't happening in a bubble. America's biggest rivals were watching every minute of it, and you can bet they were taking notes. The message this whole Greenland affair sent to the world was loud and clear. International laws and treaties, yeah, those are nice, but brute force is what really matters now. For autocratic regimes, this wasn't a crisis. It was a green light. I mean, just put yourself in Beijing's or Moscow's shoes for a second. How can the U.S. possibly lead an alliance to defend Taiwan after it just tried to strong-arm Denmark into giving up territory? How can it condemn Russia for redrawing borders in Ukraine? This whole episode gave them the perfect comeback. Hey, don't lecture us. You do the exact same thing. So while the immediate catastrophe was avoided, the crisis left these deep, lasting scars on the relationship between America and Europe. In the end, this didn't wrap up with some grand new partnership. It just ended with a quiet retreat. But those fundamental cracks in the alliance, the broken trust, the doubts about reliability, they didn't get fixed. They just got papered over, waiting for the next crisis to break them wide open again. Which brings us to one final really critical question to think about. If the United States ended up damaging its own alliances, and Europe was dragged into a costly showdown, who was the real winner of a crisis that pushed the West right to the brink?
And now that you have the full picture, it's time to go one step further. What you're about to hear is a conversation between two geopolitical analysts who have been following this crisis very closely. They're going to break down what really happened, what it means for Europe, for China, and for the future of global politics. No slogans, no noise, just a deep, honest conversation. Let's get into it.
So if you were following the news at all last week, you probably had a few of those moments where you had to check if you were reading a real newspaper.
Or The Onion, maybe?
Exactly. I mean, here we are, it's late January 2026, and we all just watched the President of the United States threaten to, brand down the entire diplomatic house?
All for a piece of real estate. Yeah, it was a real reality is stranger than fiction kind of week. We've heard the jokes about buying Greenland for years. I mean, it's been a meme since the first term.
But the laughter stopped last week.
It really did. It wasn't a joke anymore. We were suddenly hearing about threats of a naval blockade, talk of massive tariffs on the entire EU. This was genuine high-stakes brinkmanship over an island of, well, mostly ice.
It is diplomatic arson, pure and simple. You basically had the White House saying, nice little alliance you've got there. Shame if something happened to it.
And then just as the markets were getting jittery and everyone in Brussels was sweating, nothing. Silence.
A complete U-turn. The administration announces this framework deal, they shake hands, and everyone just goes home.
And that's the part that just doesn't add up if you're only reading the headlines, because the deal they announced...
It's a nothing burger.
A total nothing burger. A few more U.S. troops in the Arctic, some shared Coast Guard duties. It is, for all intents and purposes, the status quo. So they threatened to blow up the entire global order and then walked away with basically nothing.
Which is the mission for our deep dive today. We need to figure out why. You don't pull a gun, threaten to shoot, and then settle for a handshake unless something or someone made you put that gun down.
Right. And we've got a massive stack of analysis here, a lot of it centering on a breakdown from Visualpolitik that suggests this wasn't some change of heart. This was a direct collision with reality.
A very expensive, very dangerous reality.
Oh.
We are going to connect some dots today that don't usually get drawn together. We're talking Arctic ice sheets, Wall Street bond markets, and, this is the scary part, nuclear anxiety in places like Sweden and Canada.
So let's set the stage. The headlines were screaming about an invasion, but the actual strategy from the White House was maybe a little more calculated. The source material calls it extortion with a tie.
That's a perfect description.
It really is. It was a protection racket, just dressed up as diplomacy. The whole premise from the White House was pretty simple. The U.S. has subsidized European security for decades, so Denmark and the EU owe us.
And the repayment was Greenland.
Give us Greenland, or at least the resource rights and full sovereignty over the bases there as payback. The message was, give us the island or we crash your economy with tariffs.
And if that didn't work?
The implication was, well, we might just take it. The calculation in the Oval Office seemed to be that Europe relies so heavily on the U.S. for defense and trade that they would just fold.
They expected the usual response, some hand-wringing, a few strongly worded letters, and then a quiet submission.
Exactly. But that is not what happened. And I think that's where this story really begins. Europe's reaction this time was, spicy.
Spicy is putting it mildly. You had Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. And this is a guy who's usually Washington's biggest hype man in Europe.
Oh, absolutely.
He came out and said, quote, appeasement is a sign of weakness. Those are fighting words. He was basically comparing the U.S. strategy to 1930s aggression.
And it wasn't just him. Even Giorgia Meloni in Italy was calling it a clear error. Europe didn't scramble for a compromise. They dug in their heels.
So the analysis mentions this carrot-and-stick approach from the EU. The stick is obvious, refusing to sell. But what was the carrot? You have to give the other side an off-ramp, a way to save face.
And this was really smart diplomacy. The EU quietly dropped a planned digital tax on U.S. tech giants. At the same time, they tightened some screws on Chinese tech firms. They gave the White House a small, tangible win they could sell back home.
So they could say, look, we got Europe to crack down on China. It's an off-ramp. But let's be real, a tax break doesn't stop an invasion force. There had to be a much bigger gun on the table to make the U.S. blink like that.
There was. And this is the core insight that I think most of the media missed. The focus was all on the military threat, the ships, the troops. But the real war, the one that mattered, was financial. The source material calls it the Economic Suicide Pact.
Okay, let's unpack these numbers. Because we tend to think of the U.S. as holding all the economic cards. You know, we have the dollar, we have Wall Street. How does Europe threaten us?
Yeah, it's true. The U.S. is the heavyweight. But the U.S. economy is also built on foreign investment and debt, and you just can't declare economic war on your banker.
Right.
In 2024, U.S.-EU trade was over $1.6 trillion, which is massive, obviously. But the real nuclear option for Europe isn't trade, it's the assets they hold.
Their investment holdings.
Right. We're talking about all the money that European investors have parked right here in the U.S. The estimates are, they're just staggering. We're talking between $8 and $10 trillion in U.S. assets.
Wait, hold on. 10 trillion? That's a number that's hard to even wrap your head around.
Yeah. To put it in perspective for you, that's roughly a third of the entire U.S. national debt. It includes about $6 trillion in stocks and another $2 trillion in government bonds.
Wow.
And if you throw in the UK, Norway, and Switzerland, Europe effectively controls about 40% of all U.S. government bonds held by foreigners.
So if Trump had actually followed through with the tariffs or the blockade?
Europe pulls the plug. And it wouldn't even have to be a government order. If European pension funds, their banks, their insurers, if they all panicked and just started liquidating those assets to protect themselves, Wall Street collapses.
It would trigger a massive, massive sell-off.
It would be a bloodbath. The stock market crashes, the value of the dollar falls off a cliff, and this is the crucial part, U.S. borrowing costs would skyrocket. If nobody is buying your bonds or if everyone is selling them, you can't fund your government.
Not without printing money and causing hyperinflation. And to do that right before an election year.
It's political suicide. The economic advisors in the White House must have just looked at the president and said, sir, you can have Greenland, or you can have a functioning economy. You cannot have both.
It was a game of chicken, but the U.S. was driving a car made of glass.
That's a great way to put it. It reframes that whole America First idea. You can be as nationalist as you want, but you are still handcuffed to the global ledger. It's mutual assured destruction, just with bankers instead of missiles.
So the money saved the day. But this deep dive really suggests that even though the invasion was called off, something fundamental broke inside NATO last week. You can't just threaten to invade an ally and then turn around and say, just kidding.
No, you absolutely can't. Money can be recovered, right? Stock markets bounce back. But trust is much, much harder to fix. NATO is often described as a geopolitical straitjacket.
A straitjacket?
Yeah, it works because it's rigid. The core rule, the only rule that really matters, is that members do not threaten other members. You have to trust that the tank driving next to you is on your side.
And when the leader of the alliance is the one threatening to annex a member's territory.
The straitjacket just rips apart. That coercion, it basically sent a message to every capital from Berlin to Warsaw. We are allies only when it's convenient for us, otherwise you're a target. That psychological break is devastating.
It forces Europe to plan for a world where the U.S. is a potential adversary. Or at least not the guarantor it used to be.
Exactly, and we're already seeing this play out with actual hardware. The analysis highlights a specific deal with Denmark that happened right in the middle of all this mess.
This is the air defense system.
This is a huge signal that flew right under the radar for most people. Denmark just signed a deal for a new air defense system. It's about $9 billion US. Now, historically, for a NATO country, the smart money is always on buying American. You buy Patriot systems.
It's the standard play. You buy American to buy influence and to make sure everything is compatible.
Of course. But Denmark didn't buy American. They bought a European solution. And what's really critical here is that Denmark didn't have an old system to replace. They were starting from scratch. They had a blank slate, a blank check, and they consciously chose not to be dependent on U.S. technology.
That feels deliberate. That's not a pricing decision, that's a strategic hedge.
It is absolutely deliberate. The thinking in Copenhagen, and frankly in a lot of European capitals right now, is pretty clear. If we can't rely on Washington to respect our sovereignty, we can't rely on them for the off switch on our air defense.
And if that mindset starts to spread, I mean, the U.S. military-industrial complex depends heavily on Europe as a customer.
It's their bread and butter. About 2/3 of all European arms imports currently come from the U.S. That is a massive revenue stream. If Europe decides it needs strategic autonomy, and that's the buzzword in Brussels now, that money goes away.
And it's more than just losing revenue, isn't it? If Europe builds its own tanks and missiles, the U.S. loses leverage. You can't control what you don't supply.
Precisely. It's like a landlord threatening to kick you out, so you decide to go build your own house down the street. Once that house is built, the landlord has zero power over you. The U.S. is inadvertently pushing Europe to become a superpower in its own right just to protect itself from the U.S.
And while Europe is building that house, they're looking at their neighborhood very differently. Which brings us to the part of this deep dive that actually unsettled me the most. We have to talk about Canada.
Yeah, the Canadian section of the analysis it's chilling. We usually think of Canada as, safe, stable, the polite neighbor. But the source material paints this picture of genuine panic in Ottawa last week.
Well, you just have to look at the map. I pulled it up while I was reading this morning. If the U.S. had actually seized Greenland or turned it into this militarized fortress, just look at Canada's position.
It's a strategist's nightmare. You've got the U.S. mainland to the south. You've got Alaska U.S. territory to the west. And then suddenly you'd have this aggressive, militarized U.S. presence to the east.
They'd be surrounded.
Completely encircled. Canada would go from being a partner to being a dependency. The analysis points out that Trump's old jokes about making Canada the 51st state, well, they suddenly stopped feeling like jokes.
It makes you question everything.
Yeah.
If the U.S. is willing to violate Danish sovereignty for security, what makes the Canadian border so sacred?
Exactly. In this new world, a border isn't a sacred line. It's just a line on a map that can be erased. And that fear, that leads us to what they call the tail risk, the consequence that keeps intelligence analysts up at night.
The nuclear question.
The nuclear question.
It seems so extreme to even say it out loud. Canada, Sweden, developing nuclear weapons. I mean, these are the countries that usually host peace summits.
It sounds extreme until you look at the cold, hard logic of survival. For 70 years, the deal was simple. You don't need nukes because Uncle Sam has a big umbrella and he'll stand in the rain with you. But what happens when the guy holding the umbrella starts hitting you with it?
You go buy your own raincoat. Or, in this case, a bomb.
And this isn't just theoretical anymore. The analysis highlights that you have voices in the Sweden Democrats, leaders in Poland, openly discussing the need for independent nuclear deterrence. There's talk of a Eurobomb or funding the French nuclear program in exchange for coverage.
And in Canada.
Even in Canada, where this has been a taboo topic forever, the Whisper campaign has started. If international law doesn't matter, if your biggest ally is now a potential bully, then the only absolute guarantee of your own sovereignty is a nuclear weapon.
That is a terrifying thought. We spent half a century fighting non-proliferation. And in 1 week of chaotic diplomacy, we might have kickstarted an arms race among our own friends.
That's the bitter irony. The America First strategy was supposed to make America safer. Instead, it could create a world where America is surrounded by new, unpredictable nuclear powers that don't trust Washington.
It's the definition of a backfire. But while we're all freaking out about our allies, surely someone out there was enjoying the show.
Oh, absolutely. While Washington was scrambling to fix the mess it created, you can bet the champagne corks were popping in Beijing and Moscow.
Okay, let's break that down. How does a fight over Greenland help Xi Jinping?
It's all about precedent. Chinese foreign policy is obsessed with legalism, with precedent. They've been eyeing Taiwan for decades. Now, imagine if the U.S. had successfully argued it could seize Greenland because of national security or historical interests.
China just points at Taiwan and says, ditto.
Exactly. It hands them a perfect whataboutism defense. If the U.S. can claim territory based on strategic necessity, well, then China has a moral and legal alibi to do the exact same thing. It completely strips the U.S. of the moral high ground.
You did it to Denmark. Why can't we do it to Taiwan?
It makes the U.S. look like a total hypocrite. You can't police the world if you're breaking the rules yourself. And for Russia, it's even more direct.
Right. The analysis mentioned the Crimea parallel.
Putin loves to exploit these cracks. You have to remember, when Russia annexed Crimea, their main argument was the West changed borders in Kosovo first. We're just following their rules.
So if the U.S. acts like an empire grabbing land,
it validates Putin's entire worldview. It tells him his theory of spheres of influence is correct, that great powers have a natural right to dominate their neighbors. If the U.S. can bully Denmark, Russia feels justified in bullying Moldova, the Baltics, you name it.
it signals that the rules are gone. It's just the law of the jungle.
And in the law of the jungle, the park ranger has just become a poacher.
That's a haunting image. The park ranger becomes the poacher. So let's bring this all in for a landing. We started with a crazy headline, and we've ended up uncovering a near economic crash, a fractured NATO, and a propaganda victory for our rivals.
And a U-turn. We can't forget the U-turn. The invasion was called off, the tariffs were canceled, life goes on.
Right, so can we just say no harm, no foul? Do we just dodge a bullet here?
I think the source argues that while we dodged the bullet, the gun went off right next to our ear. We're deafened by it. The trust is eroded. You can't unsay a threat of invasion. You can't unring that bell.
And it was crossed.
And once a line like that is crossed, it's just gone forever. Europe is now looking inward. They know for a fact that U.S. security guarantees are conditional. They vary based on who is sitting in the Oval Office. And that realization is going to reshape the next decade more than any specific treaty.
So who actually won?
It certainly wasn't the U.S. We didn't get the island, and we lost the trust. Europe didn't win. They're now living in a much more dangerous neighborhood, having to spend billions on defense they'd rather be spending elsewhere.
Which means the only winners were the ones watching us tear ourselves apart.
Pretty much. The winners are the adversaries who get to point at all this chaos and say, see, democracy is messy and unreliable.
It's a sobering thought. We often think of security as tanks and planes and hardware. But this deep dive really hammers home that security is mostly about trust and stability and predictability. And those are things that are much, much harder to buy than an island.
Absolutely. And as we look toward the rest of 2026, the listener really needs to ask themselves a hard question. What does security actually look like when the old alliances feel like just pieces of paper? If the handshake doesn't mean anything anymore, what replaces it?
And that's the question we are going to leave you with today. If the handshake is dead, do we all need to carry a weapon? Thanks for diving deep with us. We'll see you next time.